evening and welcome. The Postal Service is part of the fabric of Orkney life, and even more so in the past 18 months of limited opportunities for travel. The title of this session comes from a poem of George Mackay Brown, born 100 years ago, whose father was a postman in Stromness. "My father passed with his bag of letters," he wrote, describing the people and places along the street. Tom Stevenson is known to science festival audiences as a professor of microelectronics, as the chairman of the Museum of Communication at Burnt Island in Fife, and as someone who's spoken in every one of the 31 Orkney International Science Festivals. In this evening's context, he is best known as a son of the post office, which his mother ran in Quoyloo for no less than 50 years. So Tom's ideally placed to tell us the story of the Postal Service in Orkney. So Tom, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Howie, and I'll just share my screen and start the presentation. I hope you should now be able to see my first title slide. So I'm very pleased to do this presentation tonight in association with the Orkney Wireless Museum and also the Museum of Communication in Burnt Island, as Howie mentioned. Now, just to put this in context, the Royal Mail, or the Postal Service, is really a lifeline service, to use the modern parlance. And it's part of the issue of personal communication. Now, we all like to chat and talk to people, and this is the very best type of communication, face-to-face, in real time. And it's been shown that about 80% of the clues that we get as to what's going on are visual. We see people's facial expressions, their body language, their gestures, but we also hear the sounds of their voices. And as long as we can hear them, we can actually get the message out, but there's more to it than just hearing. When the telephone came along, this gave us the ability to have conversations at long distance, in fact, across the world if we want to, but we lose all the visual part of the communication. This is purely the sound, purely the words, if you like, and it's not much better than a text message. Now, if you're more than about maybe 10 meters away, conversation becomes difficult. But if you can see the person, if you have line of sight, you can wave at them. And if you want to do something more complicated than saying, come here or go away or sit down, you need to be able to text them. And in fact, there is an international language called semaphore, which enables you to send text messages if you have a visual sight of the person that you're communicating with. At the end of the 18th century, a Scottish clergyman called George Murray devised an optical shutter telegraph, which is shown here, which enabled text messages to be sent over long distances. And the Admiralty set up a chain of these stations with a hut and very large shutter boards and two men with telescopes to relay messages from one hut to the next. And using this method, they could send simple messages from the Admiralty in London to their naval bases as far away as Plymouth. But I'm not going to talk about that tonight. It's a long story, and it's not relevant to the Royal Mail. So for long distance communication, people have been sending letters since they could first read and write, I guess. You can have a long, complex message. If it's sealed in an envelope, it's private. And our Royal Mail Service is reliable, but it is relatively slow. It depends on the speed of the postman, because you have to physically transfer a piece of paper in an envelope from the sender to the recipient. And there's no way you can have a rapid conversation by letter because of the travel delay. Fast forward to today, and particularly in the last year or so, we've been using more and more electronic means of communicating. And with smartphones and computers and the appropriate software, we can now have a live conversation with sound and vision, with someone anywhere in the world, really. We get an immediate response. People can react to what we say. And we can also share images and slides and drawings and anything that can be put into digital form. We can do this instantly there and then. So this is a very much better way than letters to communicate. Now, before I get on to Orkney's postal history, it's important to get the context and look at the UK as a whole. And this is a huge subject, which I'm not even going to attempt tonight, but there are references as far back as the 12th century to messengers who carried letters. I guess this would be for the Queen or the King or those and such as those. Very much a private organisation. Henry VIII set up the Royal Mail in London in 1516, but we don't know the extent of its operation. Presumably, royal messages had priority. By 1680, there's records of a penny post operating in London, a penny being the cost of delivering a letter within London. But if you ask someone, when did the Royal Mail Service begin? Most people would answer 1840, when Rowland Hill came up with the idea of prepaid postage stamps and a flat rate. Prior to this, letters, when they were delivered, might be charged to the recipient. This is a kind of new tack on junk mail. So you make the recipient pay for something and they don't know whose it is or where it's come from or anything. So that just didn't work. Whereas Rowland Hill's idea was so good, it immediately caught on. And prepaid postage stamps, the penny black was the first one, worth 1 penny. And as packages got bigger, they wanted more money for them. So the Twopenny blue was introduced. Now, you might say, what was the key technology that enabled scheduled mail services to happen? Well, it wasn't the postage stamp, although that was very important, the lick and stick postage stamp. I'll give you a clue. 1838, first Atlantic crossing by a steamship. And in the 1840s, the railways were expanded very rapidly. And both of these used steam engines. So I would say that the steam engine was one of the key inventions that enabled the postal service to get off the ground. If you think about it, in the days of sail, a sailing ship had to wait for the right kind of wind, and sometimes this might take 2 or 3 days. So it was very difficult to have a reliable schedule when you were reliant on the right kind of wind. Now, coming back to Orkney, I was surprised to find that Orkney was really quite quick off the mark. There had been postal services to Stromness and Kirkwall, but we don't know when that started or how frequent they were. But by the 1840s and 1850s, the mail service in Orkney had spread beyond Kirkwall and Stromness into the country districts and to the Isles. Small boats would sail between the Isles, delivering mail and passengers. And the whole thing rapidly expanded until people were getting 2 or 3 deliveries a week, even in far-flung parts of the Orkney mainland and the Isles. We have if you want to read a story about how the mail service developed in Orkney, I can recommend this website, rouseyremembered.com. They have a whole section on their website called Delivering the Post, and it describes how they started with people on foot delivering mail, people then later on bicycles, and finally in motor vans. And it's a fascinating story. And this is the Ronaldsay mailboat, which used to cross regularly between Ronaldsay and Avey. If we look at the map here, we can see that just distributing mail in a scattered collection of islands here is really quite a daunting task if you think about it, especially if the weather is bad. And these small boats that operated between the Isles and the Orkney mainland, and indeed between the Orkney mainland and Caithness, were remarkably bold, sometimes in bad weather, there was a tragedy when the Ronaldsay mailboat was lost, I think in 1883, with about 5 lives. That was in Einhallow Sound. The Caithness service, before the steamships came in, sometimes small boats would go from Orkney into the Pentland Firth and halfway across meet the boats coming from Caithness and transfer mail and passengers between the two and then head back home again. Some of the local delivery service was captured here on a postcard around about 1900. This is the Hoy Express, which operated between Monas Pier and Rackwick through the valley. It's an ox-drawn cart and really quite photogenic. What about delivery times? Well, this is a family letter that was sent from Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Western Canada, to Orkney. It's a reply to a letter that had been posted in Orkney on the 31st of October, 1865, and it was received on the 1st of January, 1866 in Canada. A delivery time of about 2 months. Now that's pretty remarkable because the Trans-Canadian Railway wasn't in place until 1881. So this letter probably went by steamship round Cape Horn and all the way up the western side of America. Pretty good. Here's another one from further away this time, from Brisbane in Australia to an address in Harry, posted on the 8th of September 1879 and passed through the Finstown Post Office on the 10th of November 1879 and would then have been delivered on foot to Harry from Finstown. Again, a remarkably good service given the length of the sea voyage. Now everything's bigger and better in the United States, as you know, and there they have the problem of delivering mail from one side to the other. You've probably heard of the Pony Express. This operated between St. Joseph in Missouri and Sacramento in California. And they advertised a service of 10 days to take a letter from New York to San Francisco, a bit over 3,000 miles. The first 1,000 miles from New York to St. Joseph, Missouri was done by train. There the railway line stopped, and this was in 1860. And from then on, there were a series of staging posts over a distance of, I think, 1,900 miles to Sacramento. And at Sacramento, it was transferred to a riverboat, steamboat on the river, down to San Francisco. Now, these men carried 4 saddlebags of mail, and they operated in stages of anything from 10 to 25 miles, at which point they would change horses and change riders, perhaps. And this was very successful. You can see here their charges. They had 2 deliveries a week, and their charges were $1 for a letter weighing half an ounce or less, plus $1 extra for every half ounce or less over that limit. Clearly, the capacity was limited by the weight that they could carry. Now, although this has been very famous, it only operated for 18 months. And why did it stop? Well, things changed. The railroad kept moving west, and as they did so, they put in telegraph poles and telegraph lines for signaling and also for sending text messages. And there's this old painting of a Pony Express rider lifting his hat and waving to guys who are putting in telegraph poles, which would put him out of business. Rather sad. Now, during World War I, it was realized that regular mail service to the troops on the front line was vital to maintain morale under pretty awful conditions. And right at the outbreak of the war, a huge sorting office was set up in London in Regent's Park, and it was sending 12 million letters a week to the front line. The delivery time from London was only 2 or 3 days to a soldier in a trench on the Western Front, which was amazing. Now, in Scapa Flow, there was a floating post office for the Navy on an old battleship HMS Imperieuse, and it handled up to 50,000 items a day. And they reckon that over the period of the First World War, it had handled over 130 million items of mail. Pretty remarkable service. Here's an example of some forces mail from the First World War. This was sent by a young soldier in January 1917 to his girlfriend in Preston in Lancashire. The soldiers could buy from local craftsmen embroidered cards like this, which were also sent through the forces mail. They didn't have to pay for it. And here's a picture of the couple concerned. And this couple are the parents of my colleague from the Museum of Communication, Dorothy Brankin, who has been to the Orkney Science Festival several times. Now, shipping to get mail to and from Orkney. Again, there's a very interesting history of the development of this, and you can read all about it in this book, The Days of Orkney Steam, which came out in 1971. It covers the period from the very beginning of steamboats and their service to Orkney. They said in this book that prior to the arrival of steamboats and when you had to rely on sail, some people who were heading south would make their will and have a farewell party before they left because they didn't know what their fate would be. Patricia Long on her website tells us that the first steamship that came to Stromness was the paddle steamer United Kingdom in 1826, but that was just a visit. It was not part of a service. It was not until 1833 that steam took over from sail and oar-powered ships. And this was the paddle steamer Velocity. I'm not sure how appropriate that name was, but it did provide a service from Orkney to the Scottish mainland to Aberdeen. In 1838, Kirkwall got a gasworks, and that required the import of enormous quantities of coal. So there was obviously a reasonable shipping service to Orkney then. Some of it would have been sail, but some of it would have been steam powered. By 1841, there was a weekly steamer service to Leith, taking between 34 and 40 hours from Kirkwall. Now in 1852, a new pier was built at Scrabster, and Orkney folk realised that here was an opportunity to set up a reliable mailboat service across the Pentland Firth from Stromness. It took a few years to get their act together, but Stanger's Boatyard in Stromness built the paddle steamer Royal Mail for the Pentland run, specifically for that run, and they got a contract to run the mail. It was built as a sailboat. It was sailed to the Tyne, where a yard there installed a steam engine and paddles. If we come forward to 1869, the electric telegraph arrived in Orkney. Remember the Pony Express? But it didn't really impact the mail service very much because it was much more expensive and the quantity of text that could be sent, of course, was thereby limited. So by then, the mail service was very well established in Orkney. This is a table partly from Days of Orkney Steam, the book, and it lists the dates and the names of the ships and the operator. So we see the Royal Mail starting in 1856 and operating for 12 years, operated by John Stanger. There were then various ships over the next few decades, none of which stayed for very long, and also different companies. You see the St. Olaf there operated for 8 years by the North Company. That's the North of Scotland, Orkney and Shetland Shipping Company later. And then in 1892, the first St. Ola arrived, a steamer. And there have been 3 more Olas before the Hamnavo. If you want to get a wider history of Stromness, I can recommend this book by Bryce Wilson, A History of Stromness. It covers shipping as well, but a lot of other things ranging from the Hudson's Bay Company to agriculture to merchants, everything like that. Here is a photograph of a model in the Stromness Museum of that first mailboat, the Royal Mail, from 1856. And as you can see, it was not very big, given the type of seas it was crossing, but it did seem to do a reliable service. And this is the very first St. Ola. Again, a steamboat, not very big, but she would be in use for nearly 60 years. Now, the route was not the same as it is now. You must remember that when she came into service, the Churchill barriers weren't there. So the mails from Kirkwall and the South Isles had to be got somehow across the Pentland Firth. So the route for the Ola was from Stromness to Scapa Pier to pick up the Kirkwall and Ham and East Mainland mails. They then used to hove to off Hoxa Head to allow a small boat to come out with the mails from Bury and South Ronaldsay. And so mails and passengers were transferred to the Ola at that point, and the same on the way back. I should say that, I'll go back one, the first St. Ola operated through both World Wars and had some interesting scrapes during that time. She also carried a lot of servicemen coming back to Scapa Flow. And there's a story told about one day in 1940 when a German plane had been seen dropping mines into Hoy Sound, which was obviously very dangerous. And Captain Swanson had already left Scrabster in the Ola, and he didn't have a radio. So they wondered what would they do. And the plan was that when he came into sight off Hoy, they would signal to him with a signal lamp or with flags. Unfortunately, the weather closed in and there was no way they could signal to him. So Ness Battery decided the only way to stop him was to fire a shot across the bows, which they did. And he saw this, obviously, and he thought, oh, the boys are practicing today. And he kept going. So they had to fire another shot a bit closer to him. And he then got the message that something must be pretty serious, and he turned around and went back to Scrabster. This is the second St. Ola, diesel powered, came into service in 1951. And this is the one I remember from when I was at school. The cars had to be lifted on and off. And I think it could take about 25 cars, maybe a bit more at a push. It was relatively slow compared with modern ships, but again, it did a reliable service for many years. This is the St. Ola 3. And the big step change here was roll on, roll off. So there were link span terminals at Stromness and Scrabster, and vehicles could drive on and drive off. And also the vehicle capacity was greatly increased. After Zeebrugge, the Ola had to be fitted with blisters along the side, sponsons so-called, for safety reasons. And also in the superstructure above the wheelhouse, there was a huge tank of water. This changed the characteristics of the ship completely, and it was named thereafter the Roly-Poly Ola. Well named. And this is the last Ola, which was on for 10 years up to 2002, when the Hamnavo came in. I was lucky enough in 2012 to spend time on the bridge of the Hamnavo during a crossing with Captain Willie Mackay, and that was a fabulous experience. Since then, the paint job has been, the paint livery has been changed, but otherwise it's the same ship. Now, the other way to get mail to and from Orkney is by air. And here, Orkney was in fact way ahead of the game. Thanks to the pioneer, Captain Ted Fresson. He was a World War I pilot. He'd spent time in China. After World War I, he made a living doing air shows and joyrides for people. He used to take people up for maybe a 3-minute flight, charge them 5 shillings, and he could do hundreds in a day. He'd first visited Orkney in 1931, doing these sort of joyrides, and he could see the potential for an air service to and from Orkney from Inverness. And this he managed to establish from 1933. After a test flight, he realized he needed to get some revenue other than just passengers. And he contacted the Scotsman newspaper. They were very keen to get a daily delivery of their newspapers. So in 1933, he had his passengers and he also had daily newspapers to deliver. His service proved to be very reliable. I think it was over 97% reliable. And based on that, the General Post Office gave him an airmail contract. And this was the very first airmail service in the UK to operate at normal rates. So again, Orkney was ahead of the game. He also did air ambulances when required. By July 1939, he had a mail contract to deliver mail to North Ronaldsay, where the steamer service was particularly poor. But unfortunately, when the Second World War broke out, these services were curtailed. I've reread Fresson's memoirs, The Air Road to the Isles, for this lecture, and I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a really good read. It's not just this period he covers, he covers the post-war era as well. So the airmail service started on the 29th of May 1934, and this is a specially printed envelope that was posted from Kirkwall to an address in Glasgow. Now you can see its date stamp Kirkwall in the top right corner there. And at Inverness, there was an appropriate ceremony with VIPs. And here is a photograph of Captain Fresson in the +4 being presented with a pennant, which was to be taken to Kirkwall. He took about 2,000 letters to Kirkwall on that first flight. And on the return flight from Orkney to Inverness, he had about 12,000 letters. So it was off to a good start. Now, in the rest of 1934, he spent some time in Orkney in the North Isles, going round trying to identify sites for an internal air service. You can see how forward thinking he was. And North Ronaldsay, having a poor steamer service, was an obvious candidate. He went there and identified a possible landing site for larger planes. If two fields could be merged, these two fields were part of Holland Farm, roughly where the red cross is on the slide there. And he looked at it and decided that it was going to be too difficult because 300 yards of dike had to be removed and there were lots of humps and hollows and stones and so on. But the postmaster, Mr. Swanee, said, leave it to me. And he had a public meeting at the post office and said, right, folks, here's the deal. If we can create an airfield, we can have an air service. Everyone was very keen. So he asked who would be willing to help to remove this dike and sort the surface. And lots of hands shot up. And the very next day, there were 60 men with 20 carts and horses. And they shifted the dike, dealt with the humps and hollows and stones, and it was all done in one day. A pretty remarkable achievement. And thereafter, they had 2 flights a day, 3 times a week, plus air ambulance flights. And the story is that one of the first air ambulance flights was for the postman, who was in severe pain with an abdominal blockage. And he was flown into Kirkwall, and they found that he had swallowed a denture in his sleep. So perhaps this was a lesson to him. This is a picture of the first air service to North Ronaldsay on the 11th of August, 1834. I've checked, it was a Saturday, and it could well have been the county show day. There were certainly more people there than could get on that aircraft, that's for sure. And here's another picture of North Ronaldsay folk about to board the plane with lots of farm produce. And Ian Scott tells me that this was probably a staged publicity photograph for the airline. This is a special picture taken at the end of July 1939, the first air service of mail to North Ronaldsay under the post office contract. Sadly, this would be curtailed shortly afterwards with the outbreak of World War II. And in fact, they wouldn't have another air service until the Loganair service in 1967. But here's another one, not related to postage, but communication, where Orkney was ahead of the game. In 1908, a ship called the Isle of Erin was lost off North Ronaldsay in atrocious weather. It might have been possible to rescue the people, but none of the North Ronaldsay boats were adequate for the task. And there was no way the folk in North Ronaldsay could raise the alarm and summon help from a lifeboat or anything else. The reason being that the telegraph line only went as far as Sandy, and there was no telegraph line between Sandy and North Ronaldsay because the seabed conditions were too bad for a cable. So there was such a stooshy after this loss of life that could have been avoided perhaps, that the post office introduced this new wireless telegraphy service between the post offices in North Ronaldsay and Sandy, a distance of about 13 miles. The operators at each end were trained to use the Marconi equipment, and this system stayed in use until 1947. It started in 1910. This is an example of the Morse key from the North Ronaldsay Post Office that's in the Orkney Wireless Museum now. William Scott, who was the operator in North Ronaldsay, became a radio ham, and he added tuning coils to the set so that he could receive signals from Paris. And he used to pick up news and weather forecasts and the like. His big problem was the electricity to power the set. He didn't have a generator and relied on Lagrange cells, that is primary cells, which had to be freshed with chemicals which came on the steamer. So that was a big problem. But forever he was known as Wireless Willie. Here's a picture of a Loganair Islander over Kirkwall. This service started in 1967 and is still running. And it, again, is a lifeline service for all the North Isles. Captain Fresson's pioneering work has been commemorated many times. This is a lovely restored de Havilland Dragon Rapide that came to Kirkwall Airport as part of the Air Festival in 2015 and offered joyrides to people. Beautiful aircraft. Now, in his introduction, Howie mentioned my mother running the Quoyloo Post Office. This is an old photograph. I think it's about 1963 of Quoyloo as it was then. And you can see the sort of points I've marked here, the manse, which is a clear landmark, the old school, which is still a community centre, and on the extreme right, the school, which is now the brewery. The first post office was in this building here, across next to the manse, and it operated until 1943. And when the postmistress there, who was known as Mimey of the Post, announced she was going to retire, my parents built an extension on Stove, which became the post office, and had a telephone box eventually outside. Then when my mother retired in 1993, it moved to Icebester Shop, which unfortunately is off this picture, but they have a website, and that's a picture of the shop where the post office has been situated since 1993. This is an aerial photograph of the Quoyloo Post Office as it was in about 1985. See the red telephone box there? I'm dating this picture by the two cars that are in the picture. My father's red estate and the green estate that's on the road belonged to Peter Sinclair of Quays, and he was probably there for his pension. He died in 1987, so I can narrow it down to that sort of timescale. Now, I don't have a picture of my mother in the post office, I'm sad to say, but this is a picture of my parents at their diamond wedding anniversary in Wiley's Tea Room in Harry on the 9th of December 1992, when my mother was still running the post office at that stage. We came to Orkney for that event, and I remember it was very snowy. It was very snowy on the road up and in Orkney, and I was glad I had studded tyres on the car. And this is Stove as it is now, minus the phone box and with a new roof. Now, the post office in Orkney employed a lot of people, as you will have gathered. The Quoyloo Post Office was originally in the town hall, and then it moved to the current location on the back road in 1960. This is the Stromness Post Office with which the Quoyloo Post Office was linked. And this is the staff, I think, in about 1955. You see, it's quite a large number of people. Some of the postmen are in the back row there with their hats on. And the gentleman in the centre front is Doddy Robertson, who was the postmaster, and also the Provost of Stromness. I'm sure Howie will be able to name just about everyone from left to right in every row, but we don't have time for that tonight. Here's another picture of some Stromness postmen with their vans. And I'm going to ask you to focus in on this chap here. This is Jim Craigie, or Jimmy Craigie, who was the Quoyloo postman. He operated out of, from Quoyloo. He took the mails to Stromness, and then he picked up the mails for delivery, delivered them back around the district, back home again. I remember his post van used to do 51 miles a day, and that was seen as a huge daily mileage in those days. He was quite a character. My mother used to say he used to wish her Happy New Year for about 3 weeks in January. The vans were all the same, really. They were Morris 8 vans based on the Series E car. They're called the Series Z van. This is a telephone version of it with a ladder rack on the top, but otherwise it's pretty well the same vehicle as the post vans. Now, Jim Craigie had been born and brought up in Ronaldsay, on the west side of Ronaldsay, and he had been a postman there in the 1920s. This is a picture of him with his post office bike and a bag of mail. He had trained as a joiner with his father, who had the joiner shop in Ronaldsay. But his career as a postman in Ronaldsay came to an end when, in the 1930s, they introduced motor vans. And of course, they had several delivery people to cover the island of Ronaldsay on foot and on bike. But a van could do most of it with one guy. So Jim was offered an alternative job as a postman in Quoyloo, which he took up, and he stayed there till he retired. As well as being a postman, he was a very gifted musician. He was a fiddle player. I think he also made fiddles, and he composed lots of fiddle music that are still tunes that are still played to this day. One of the best known is Maggie Watson's Farewell to Blackhammer. Now, after he retired in Quoyloo, he moved back to Ronaldsay, and in fact, he moved back to where he was born, to the house known as Death. And after he retired, there was a collection in the district to buy him a present. And I remember my mother collecting money from customers, and quite a large sum was collected at that time. I can't remember the numbers, but it was enough to buy a very good quality Murphy wireless set. And I remember as a family going across to Ronaldsay for the day with this wireless set to present to Jim at Death. And it had a little engraved plaque on it as well. And this is a photograph from the Ronaldsay Remembered website of Jim Craigie sitting by the fireside at Death, and there is that wireless set. I wonder what happened to it. But the person who runs the Ronaldsay Remembered website now lives in Death, Jim Craigie's house. And when he moved there, he found the postman's cap, still with the number 47. So what about the future of letters? Well, I think the volume of letters will continue to decline. They're quite expensive now, if you're sending a lot, and there are alternatives. But they will remain for special things, special cards, and things that cannot be done by a computer. For instance, letters to old folk who don't have smartphones and don't have computers and are not interested in this new technology. And what about things that can't go in the bag of letters? Here are two parcels that were delivered to me fairly recently. These would not go in the bag of letters. Mail order has been important to Orkney for decades, and it's becoming more important as more people do online shopping. Royal Mail lost its monopoly in 2006, and so there are now lots of independent couriers who are undercutting Royal Mail. If you buy things off eBay, it typically will not come by Royal Mail. It might come by Hermes or UPS or whatever. And there's a feeling that when it comes to delivery to Orkney, most of these courier companies are just not interested, or they charge so much, it's very expensive. So Orkney may be being overcharged for parcels. And what about the future? Well, I think the electronics technology is here to stay. It will become more and more important. I think what we've learned since lockdown is that it's often not necessary to travel if you have a good internet connection and you can use the appropriate software like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. It's almost as good as a face-to-face meeting. So if you don't have to physically go there, it's not really necessary. But we're always going to need a parcel service. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's drones. I don't think it's rockets. I think it'll still be a man in a van. At this point, I would like to thank you very much for continuing to support the Orkney Science Festival. And I would like to say a special thank you to Max Fletcher and Tommy Gibson from Ronaldsay for permission to use the photographs from the Ronaldsay Remembered website and for all the information on that website. Thank you very much.
And that is fascinating, Tom. Some beautiful scenes, and lovely to see Jim Craigie in his house by his fireside, puffing his pipe in great contentment. While you've been speaking, you've been encouraging questions to emerge, and your mention of the early boats interested a number of people. And one question is, how were they actually funded?
I think it was private enterprise. I don't think there was government subsidy in the early days. I think it had to be private enterprise, which probably put a limit on, the size of vessel that could be funded, and also on the prices and the costs of travel. The mail contract was key, certainly, to maintaining the regular link across the Pentland Firth. That was subsidised by the post office. I seem to recall seeing that it ran at a deficit financially, as far as the post office was concerned. So if you like, Orkney was subsidised, the Orkney mail service was subsidised by the rest of the country because of the travel difficulties.
And this was really the concept then of the postal service, to be a truly national one, to cover every single corner of Britain.
That's right. And it still does. And if you think about it, to set up a competitor to the post office, you have to offer a daily service 6 days a week to every address in the United Kingdom. It's really a tall order. And I hope that the Royal Mail will exploit this and get their act together, because they should be able to see off competition. But certainly, it's a good service, and we should support it.
Another question, Tom, has come in about how long some of those sea journeys for the mailboats took. One viewer had noted your story about the St. Ola coming across and having to turn back again to Scrabster, and they were thinking that the passengers on board might have had quite a long sea journey. What sort of durations were there?
Well, I think when they went their long route from Stromness to Scapa to Hoxa to Scrabster, it was about 3 hours or more, one way. So it was one trip per day, really, that they could do. That incident in 1940, the postscript, which I didn't add, it's on Patricia Long's website, is that the weather was a bit rough that day. And apparently, according to Captain Swanson, by the time they got back to Scrabster, some of the passengers were wishing they'd actually sunk. They were so ill. So
very interesting too what you were saying about the sheer impact of the steamship. So I guess thinking back to the days of sailing ships, sail on its own would simply not have been possible for any postal service to develop.
Well, it would have been very intermittent, I think. Of course, it's easy for us to look back and say that would be hopeless, but if you had nothing else, you know, people would probably accept a delay of a week because it was the wrong kind of wind, because they could see it was the wrong kind of wind. You know, it's a kind of different attitude. We're so used to things happening, you know, to schedule, and only being disrupted by extreme weather, that just the wrong kind of wind, even if it's not very strong, could have been bad for a sailing ship.
But then the full-scale postal service would depend so much on precise coordination. You know, the mail van going down to the Ola and collecting the bags of mail. Everything would, right across the country, really, of course, with trains and planes, everything would actually work to a timetable. Yes,
and the trains, the railway system, really were the first to introduce a strict timetable. In fact, the sort of concept of Greenwich Mean Time, standard time, was introduced by the railways, because in the early days of the railways, apparently the west of England had a slightly different time from London. And this caused chaos when it came to signalling. And I don't think they ever had two trains going in opposite directions at the same time, but they introduced the concept of a standard time throughout the whole UK. And of course, that time signal was sent by the electric telegraph to make sure that they were all working to the same time. So the railway infrastructure was very important to the mail system.
And you also spoke about the post offices at Quoyloo, of course, and at Stromness, and the range of items that were sent. And there's one question about the role of the post office. It would be really a kind of central place in the community where people would meet or people would come and go.
That's right. It was, it was a social thing as well. And, you know, all the latest news and so on would be exchanged, meeting in the post office. And yes, I listed there some of the things that I remember going through the mail in the 1950s. And rationing was still in force, and Orkney had plenty of food. So people used to post produce to relatives in the south, eggs and cheese and hens and ducks and geese and all that sort of thing. And sometimes these animals weren't even wrapped. They might be in a Hessian sack, but sometimes they were just as they came with a label tied around a leg in the post. And I don't think we'd get away with that now if you tried it.
This is full of so many stories, Tom, and I know that a number of people have more questions to ask, and I should say there's an opportunity to ask more questions and to discuss generally at the Festival Club, which is now open, and Tom will be there along with some of the other speakers, helpers and festival friends. And to go along, you just need to click on the Festival Club link on the YouTube or website pages, and you will be warmly welcome. In the meantime, Tom, a big thank you to you for such a fascinating account of the postal service in Orkney. Big thank you to Swain and the technical team for looking after everything behind the scenes, and of course to everyone viewing and joining us this evening. To you all, thank you and goodbye now.
Thank you, goodbye.